She thought she was in charge and could decide who belonged and who didn't. What she didn't know was that the man she embarrassed in first class owned the whole airline, and by the time she found out, it was too late. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The first-class cabin had an air of quiet luxury, with plush seats that were spread out and had plenty of legroom. Soft lighting and the sound of glasses clinking filled the space as flight attendants quickly offered drinks and warm greetings to some, but not all of the passengers. Amir adjusted the sleeve of his tailored suit. He stood straight, his expression blank. Next to him, his wife Noelle looked at the flight attendant with quiet observation, her finger lightly tapping against the armrest. Their 16-year-old son Elias sat next to her, headphones in his ear and a sharp gaze flickering around the cabin. First, there was an unspoken shift in attention, a glance that lingered a second too long, a missing welcome. Miss Langley, the flight attendant in charge of their section, made her way through the rows, greeting each passenger warmly, offering menus, and making light conversation. She was professional and efficient until she got to their seats, where she walked right past them without pausing. Elias frowned and pulled out his headphones. "She skipped us," he said, shifting in his seat. Noelle put her hand on his arm, and her face was calm, but Amir didn't say anything because he knew, let it go. Instead, he leaned back and tapped lightly on the armrest while watching Miss Langley continue her rounds. He had seen this too many times before. People like her always thought that if they were subtle, no one would notice. Minutes went by before Miss Langley came back with a tray of champagne. She walked down the aisle, her voice light and friendly, as she handed glasses to each passenger. "Would you like a glass, sir?" she asked the older man. The man sitting across from them smiled and accepted, and she moved on to the next passenger, offering another smile. When she got to Amir, Noelle, and Elias, she hesitated for a second, but she didn't ask, she kept walking. Elias muttered under his breath, "Well," and Noelle let out a soft breath. She wasn't surprised. She had spent years in places where people thought they didn't belong, and she knew how Miss Langley's smile tightened when she looked their way. Amir stayed calm, but a flicker of something that couldn't be read crossed his mind without him saying a word. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a short message. He then sent it and slipped the device back into his jacket. A few rows away, Camilla, another flight attendant, noticed what had happened. She paused as she restocked the drink cart and watched as Miss Langley avoided their row completely. She frowned a little but didn't say anything for now. Soon after, meal service began, and Miss Langley moved quickly through the rows, offering premium. "There is seared salmon filet mignon at a vegetarian pasta auction." She smiled and handed menus to the people in the row ahead of her. She continued down the aisle, handing out menus until she reached Amir's family. Noelle tilted her head slightly and watched as Langley turned away without stopping. Elias was the first to react. He let out a low laugh and shook his head. "That's crazy," he said. A few minutes later, Langley came back with a tray, but instead of giving them choices, she put her hand on her hip and Amir raised an eyebrow, but his expression couldn't be read. "The others were given options," he said calmly. Miss Langley barely met his gaze, and the other passengers ordered first. Elias gasped in shock, "We never even got a menu." Miss Langley didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted her weight and tightened her grip on the tray, saying in a sharper voice that first-class meals are limited and priority goes to high-status passengers. Noelle let out a quiet laugh under her breath. She had seen that before. Amir leaned forward a little and rested his elbows on his knees. His tone was still calm and patient. That's interesting, he said, because as far as I know, we're in first class. Miss Langley straightened up as if she was getting angry. If there's an issue, sir, you're welcome to speak to the gate agent after landing, he said. Elias shook his head and whispered, she's serious. Miss Langley turned and walked away before anyone else could say anything else. Camilla had been watching for May. Finally stepped forward, lowered her voice, and said, I'll make sure you get the full menu. She smiled and said, thank you. Noel quietly nodded. Amir didn't look at Camilla. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a short message. He hovered his thumb over the screen for a moment before pressing send. Elias turned toward him, curious about who it was. Amir looked down at his phone as it vibrated with a reply. He locked the screen again, and a small knowing smile played at the corner of his mouth. The captain simply said, Miss Langley, you just made a terrible mistake. Elias blinked, and Noelle closed her eyes and let out a short breath through her nose. She had been married to Amir long enough to know what that meant. Miss Langley walked back to the front of the cabin, her posture straight and her face calm. She didn't need to look in the mirror to know she looked professional and in charge. She had been working flights like this for years and had dealt with enough passengers to know when to stop people from complaining. She made a. Despite Camilla's clear awareness of what had happened, she ignored her. It didn't matter, people complained all the time, and most of them went nowhere. She had done her job. If that family had a problem, they could talk to someone else after the flight. But just as she was about to walk back into the first-class cabin, the intercom went off. Miss Langley, please report to the cockpit immediately. The words sent a chill down her spine, and she looked at the lead attendant who gave her a. She gave him a questioning look, but she didn't have an answer. Her stomach twisted a little as she set down her tray and made her way to the front of the plane. Inside the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was sitting with his hands on the controls, and his gaze was calm but firm. He wasn't alone. A video call was playing on the small screen, and the face of Nicholas Grant, the airline's flight operations director, was staring back at her. She couldn't read his expression, but the tightness in his jaw made her throat dry. We've received a report about a service problem in first class, sir. Miss Langley swallowed and clasped her hands behind her back. Her years of experience told her to stay calm and write the report. Nicholas Grant leaned slightly forward on the screen and said, a first-class passenger was denied standard service and treated differently than others in their section. That passenger is Air Rahim. Miss Langley's stomach dropped, and Captain Reynolds gave her a long, hard look. Do you know who Amir Rahim is? Nicholas Grant's tone was flat. He's not. The silence stretched, and Miss Langley could feel her palms getting sweaty. Captain Reynolds spoke again, this time with a heavy voice that made her skin prickle. Amir Rahim is the owner of this airline, he said. Miss Langley's mind went blank. She had spent the last hour treating the CEO of the company she worked for like a passenger who didn't belong. She had ignored his family's requests and brushed off their complaints. While smiling and helping other people, Nicholas Grant slowly let out a breath. Mr. Rahim has asked that you personally go back to his family, apologize, and make sure they get the full first-class experience they paid for, he said. Mr. Langley's mouth felt dry. Sir, I didn't know that was exactly the problem. You assumed you made a decision based on that assumption, and now you're facing the consequences. Captain Reynolds' voice stayed calm, but his words were firm. The call ended, and Miss Langley stood still for a moment before finally stepping out of the cockpit. Her heart was racing. She had been in charge just moments before, but now she wasn't in charge of anything, and she had no idea how bad things were about to get. Miss Langley's footsteps sounded heavier as she walked back down the aisle. Her heartbeat drowned out the soft murmurs of passengers around her. She had always walked through first class with confidence because she knew she was in charge. Every step in the cabin felt like a countdown to disaster this time. She saw Airwahi sitting still and calm. He had one leg crossed over the other and his fingers resting on the armrest. He couldn't read her face. Noelle was sitting next to him, her lips pressed together and a quiet amusement flickering in her eyes. Elias, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as subtle. He was watching her approach with open curiosity, waiting to see how this would play out. Miss Langley stopped in front of him and adjusted her posture. People nearby had seen her and were looking back and forth between her and Amir's family. She had no choice but to do this in front of him. She cleared her throat and said, "Mr. Rahim, I'd like to." Amir raised his hand and cut her off before she could continue. "Before you speak," he said, "I have a question." Miss Langley swallowed and said, "Of course, sir." His voice stayed steady as he asked, "At any point during this flight, did you ask any other first-class passengers if they were in the right seat?" The question hit her harder than she thought, but she knew the answer. Everyone was looking at her, and she tightened her fingers on her uniform as she said, "No, sir." Amir tilted his head slightly and asked, "Did you give every other passenger a drink and menu before takeoff?" Miss Langley could feel the weight of the eyes on her, and she could see Camilla standing nearby with her arms crossed, carefully listening. "No, sir," she said again, but this time her voice was lower. Elias leaned back and laughed a small laugh. "That's crazy," Noelle exhaled slowly. "But you told us priority." Several people around her shifted uncomfortably. The truth was heavy in the air. It was undeniable and embarrassing. Miss Langley forced a small smile, but it barely held. "I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding. I want to correct my mistake." Amir's expression didn't change. He looked at her for a long, silent moment before finally nodding once. "All right," he said simply, "then do it properly." Miss Langley hesitated, not sure what he meant until she realized he wasn't just asking. She slowly took a deep breath and forced herself to look him in the eyes. "I'm sorry for my bad judgment and the way I treated you and your family," she said in a voice just loud enough for everyone else to hear. "It was unprofessional and unfair." Amir let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding, "Good." He then said, "Now let's see if your actions match your words." Miss Langley felt heat rise up her neck, but she stiffly nodded, "Of course, sir. I'll make sure your family gets the full." As she quickly walked toward the galley, her hands shook a little, but she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach as she disappeared into the back. This wasn't over, it wasn't even close. Miss Langley walked into the galley, grabbing the edge of the counter as she took a slow breath. Her hand shook a little as she reached for a tray, forcing herself to focus. The flight attendants around her looked at her, but didn't say anything. Camilla, on the other hand, wasn't so quiet. She leaned against the counter arms. Miss Langley gave her a dirty look and said, "Not now, Camilla." Camilla shrugged and said, "Just saying you embarrassed a billionaire and his family in front of the whole first-class cabin. And now you think handing him a better meal and a drink will fix it?" Miss Langley clenched her jaw and her fingers tightened around the tray. "I did what I was supposed to do. I apologized." Camilla laughed softly and shook her head. "You apologized because you got caught." Miss Langley didn't pay attention to her. When she went back to the food service area, she quickly grabbed a menu that she should have given Amir's family when they first got on the plane and put it on a tray with a selection of premium drinks. She couldn't make another mistake, so she carefully balanced the tray as she stepped out of the galley, her face calm but her mind racing. She walked slowly up to Air's row and set the menu down in front of him, saying, "Mr. Rahim, I'm sorry I didn't give you this earlier. Please take your time choosing your meal." Amir took the menu without saying a word. She then turned to Noel and Elias and asked, "Can I offer you any refreshments?" Noel didn't answer right away. She just looked at Miss Langley for a moment before speaking. "Are you asking because you want to, or because you have to?" Miss Langley asked. Elias let out a quiet laugh. "That's what I thought." There was more silence after that. Some people nearby were pretending not to listen. They were paying attention. Miss Langley forced a tight smile and said, "I promise I'm here to serve all of our first-class passengers equally." Amir put down the menu and looked at her blankly. He reached for his phone, quickly typed something, and put it back in his jacket. He then leaned back in his seat and studied her in the same calm, measured way he had since the beginning. Miss Langley didn't know what to say next. She had done what she was told, apologized, and offered service, but... As she turned to leave, Elias spoke again. "She's nervous," he said in a funny way. "She knows this isn't over." Miss Langley stiffened, but didn't turn back. She walked toward the galley with her heart racing, and for the first time in her career, she felt something strange creeping in fear. Miss Langley stepped back into the galley and pressed her hands against the counter to steady herself. The knot in her stomach had grown, making it hard to take a deep breath. Not just a difficult passenger complaint, it was something much worse. She had worked with celebrities, executives, and even politicians, but none of them owned the airline she worked for. She had treated Amir Rahim's family like they didn't belong, and now every step she took felt like a mistake she couldn't fix. Camila stood across from her with her arms crossed, her face blank. "You should probably sit down before you collapse," Miss Langley told her. "I'm fine," Camila asked. Miss Langley ignored her because she was busy with the drink cart, but her hands were shaking. The buzz of the in-flight phone made her jump, but she quickly calmed down and picked it up. It was Captain Reynolds. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, and Miss Langley answered, "Yes, Captain." There was a short silence before he spoke again. "You'll need to prepare for a conversation with airline executives upon landing." The words hit her like a punch in the stomach, and she loosened her grip on the. "I apologize to Mr. Rahim and his family, and I'll make sure they get the service they deserve." The captain cut him off. "You ignored basic courtesy from a first-class passenger and his family, and you did it without thinking about why." Miss Langley's mouth felt dry. "You only have one job," Captain Reynolds continued, "and that was to give equal service to everyone in your section, which didn't happen. Now you'll have to explain why." Miss Langley swallowed hard. With a soft click, she put the phone back on the receiver, her fingers shaking a little. Camila let out a slow breath and shook her head. "That bad, huh?" Miss Langley gave her a dirty look, but this time she didn't have the energy to argue because she knew her career was in danger and there was nothing she could do to stop what was going to happen. Miss Langley gripped the edge of the counter, her breath uneven, as the realization hit her like a rock. This wasn't just a complaint, this was a formal. He was the one who filed the report, not another passenger. She thought of all the possible explanations and ways to make things better, but none of them worked because there were too many witnesses and too many people who knew exactly what she had done. She could feel their eyes on her every time she stepped out of the galley, so she straightened up her uniform and went out again, determined to act like everything was fine. But as she walked through first class, she noticed that shift passengers who had ignored her before now looked at her. People were watching her with something different: curiosity, judgment, and a focus on the tray she was carrying. She tried to ignore it by focusing on the people she was talking to and the tray she was carrying. When she got to Amir's row, she made sure to keep her voice professional and asked, Mr. and Mrs. Rahimalias, would you like anything else? A drink or a warm towel? Elias raised an eyebrow and said, now you're asking Miss Langley's. There was a twitch in Noelle's fingers as she breathed out through her nose and lifted her glass slightly. I think we're fine, she said. Amir, on the other hand, barely looked up from his phone. He looked at the screen once before putting it away, and when he finally met her eyes, he couldn't read her expression. You've already been informed, haven't you? He asked her in a casual tone. Sir, you've been told what's waiting for you when we land, he said in a calm, almost casual voice. He already knew the answer, so she just stiffly nodded yes. You should have thought about that before you decided we weren't high enough status for first class, Elias said with a short laugh. Miss Langley flinched, but Amir raised his hand to signal for Elias to stop. Enough, Amir said. He studied Miss Langley for a moment longer, his eyes sharp and calculating, and then he turned back toward his window and ignored her. That was worse than anything he could have said, Miss Langley said. Walked away, but the shame was still burning through her. She had always been in charge, setting the rules, but now she wasn't. What was worse, she didn't know how much further she was about to fall. Miss Langley went back to the galley, but this time she didn't stop to catch her breath, because she couldn't afford to. As soon as she walked in, she grabbed a bottle of water and twisted the cap open with trembling fingers. Camilla was still watching her carefully, but unlike before, she didn't move. I think Camilla said, finally, he told you exactly what you already knew. Miss Langley didn't answer, but she did take a slow sip of water to try to ease the dryness in her throat. Camilla sighed and leaned against the counter. Look, I get it. You probably thought you were just doing what you've done 100 times before, making a little judgment call. You thought no one would notice, she said. But this time you picked the wrong family. Miss Langley tightened her grip on Camilla. Camilla pushed off the counter and folded her arms. You keep acting like this is something you can smooth over like it's just a bad shift or a misunderstanding, but it's not, she said, pausing to let her words sink in. This isn't going away. Miss Langley closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath before setting the bottle down. I don't need your pity, she said. Oh, I'm not pitying you, I just think it's funny. Camilla laughed briefly. What's funny? Miss Langley asked. She pointed to the cabin and said, for years she'd been the one making passengers feel small and making them question whether they deserve to be here. Before Miss Langley could answer, the intercom went off again, saying, Miss Langley, please report to the cockpit immediately. The words didn't just send a chill down her spine, they confirmed what she already knew. She wasn't going to be able to get off this flight the same way she got on it, and she might not be able to. Miss Langley stood still for a moment, holding on to the counter like it was the only thing holding her up. The words from the intercom echoed in her head louder than before. This wasn't a normal call, and she couldn't ignore it. Camilla tilted her head and watched her closely. Are you going to stand there all day, or are you going to face it? She asked. Miss Langley forced a sharp breath into her nose as she straightened her uniform. She had worked too hard and spent too many years. She had worked hard to get where she was, and wasn't going to let one mistake or bad judgment bring her down. She was a senior flight attendant with authority, so she wasn't going to walk into the cockpit like a scared child. She turned around and walked quickly to the front of the plane. The cabin felt suffocating now, with everyone's eyes on her more than before. She could hear low voices talking about what had just happened, everyone knew. When she got to the cockpit door, she knocked once before stepping inside. Reynolds was already waiting for her with his hands folded neatly in his lap. His expression was blank, but the way he motioned for her to sit made it clear that this wasn't going to be a short conversation. The screen next to him flickered on, and once again Nicholas Grad's face appeared. She sat down in the chair with her back straight, swallowing hard as she did so. Nicholas didn't waste any time, saying in a sharp voice, "We've received confirmation from multiple passengers regarding your treatment of Mr. Rahim and his family. Not only did you not provide standard service, but you also made an assumption about their place in first class and acted accordingly." Miss Langley's palms were sweaty, but she kept her cool. "Sir, I sincerely regret the situation," she said. "I don't need rehearsed apologies, Miss Langley. I need facts." Nicholas cut her off with a hand. Captain Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "Did you question any other passengers about their seats?" And Langley hesitated. "No," Nicholas replied. "Sir." She felt her throat tighten as she asked, "Sir, did you tell them that high-status passengers get priority?" It was clear that they weren't among them. She wished she could lie and make it all go away, but there were too many witnesses who saw exactly what she had done. "Yes," she said, her voice quieter now. Nicholas slowly exhaled and shook his head. "You do realize that Amir Rahim isn't just the CEO of this airline, don't you? He's one of the most important people in the world. In the aviation industry, his company not only owns this airline, it also funds half of the partnerships that keep your job running," Nicholas said in a firm voice. "He hasn't asked for your immediate termination, he's letting the board decide," Nicholas said. "But I can tell you now that this isn't going to be ignored." Miss Langley's lips parted slightly. Termination. The word felt strange in her mouth. She had worked here for years. Could she really be fired for one mistake? Captain Reynolds's face softened a little, but his voice stayed steady. "You didn't just make a mistake, Miss Langley. You made a choice, and now you have to face the consequences." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Finally, Nicholas leaned back and adjusted his tie. "For now, you will continue the remainder of this flight, but when we land, you are to report directly to airline security. A meeting with the board will be set up. You have 24 hours to decide your future with this company." Miss Langley felt dizzy. I know she forced out a word, but her voice barely sounded like her own. Nickel nodded once, and the screen went dark. Captain Reynolds didn't speak right away. He just looked at her for a long time, before finally exhaling through his nose. "I suggest you use the rest of this flight to think about Miss Langley." She wanted to say something, but couldn't. She slowly rose from her seat and nodded before. As she stepped out of the cockpit and back into the cabin, it felt smaller and more suffocating. She had never been so hyper-aware of every look and whisper. The people she had once ignored were now watching her fall in real time, and as she walked past Air Rahim's row, she didn't dare meet his gaze because she knew this wasn't just a flight, this was the moment her whole career fell apart. Miss Langley walked stiffly through the first-class cabin, her hands clenched at her sides, and her breathing was shallow. The plane hadn't felt this small before. When they first took off, every step felt like she was going through a tunnel that was closing in on her. She tried to keep her eyes on the road ahead, but she could feel the stares. Some passengers quickly turned away when she went by, pretending to be busy with their drinks or the entertainment system. Others didn't bother hiding their interest. They had heard the captain's announcement, seen the apology, and were now seeing her fall from grace in real time. Her stake wasn't just talked about, it was a reality. As soon as she got to the galley, she leaned against the counter and took a deep breath. Camila was still waiting for her, but this time, unlike the last time, she didn't have a smirk on her face. "That bad, huh?" Miss Langley closed her eyes for a moment, trying to clear her throat. "I have to meet with the board when we land." Camila let out a slow breath and nodded. "That's bad." Miss Langley didn't say anything. Instead, she reached for a glass and filled it with. Camila looked at her closely and then spoke again, but this time her voice was softer. You knew this was going to happen. Miss Langley tightened her grip on the glass. I didn't think it would go this far. Camila breathed out through her nose. People like him don't let things slide. Miss Langley finally turned toward her and said, I'm sorry, I did everything I could to fix it. Camila raised an eyebrow and asked, did you, or did you just try to fix how it looked? Miss Langley opened her mouth, but nothing came out because she knew in her heart that she had. She knew the answer. She hadn't apologized because she felt bad about what she did. She did it because she had to. Amir he knew that. Em shook her head and said, you think this is just about an apology? This is about the fact that you made a decision the moment you looked at him and assumed he wasn't supposed to be here. She crossed her arms and said, and you only regret it now because you got caught. Em Langley felt something bitter rise in her throat. Aren't you enjoying this? Camila laughed, but I think it's about time you experienced what it's like to be on the other side. Em Langley's jaw tightened. I've worked too hard for this. They can't just do it. Camila cut her off, and they will. Those words hung heavy and final in the air between them for years. Miss Langley had walked these aisles with competence, her authority unquestioned. She had made decisions about passengers based on nothing more than her gut feelings, turned people away with a polite dismissal, and assumed she was right, never thinking she might be wrong. Before she could answer, the in-flight phone rang again. Miss Langley slowly picked it up, staring at it as if it were a countdown to something she didn't want to face. This is M. Langley, said the voice on the other end. This is Rahim. Her breath caught in her throat. I assume you already know what's waiting for you when we land, he said. Good, Miss Langley swallowed. There was. After a short pause, she asked, Sir, would you have treated my family differently if you had known who I was? Miss Langley's throat felt dry. She knew the answer, but didn't want to say it. There was a long pause, and then she finally spoke. I would have treated you with the same level of service as any other first-class passenger. Amir gave a quiet hum, which was interesting, because that wasn't what she had asked. Miss Langley's chest tightened, and the pain that followed was unbearable. You don't regret what you did, you regret that it was me, he said in a slightly lower, sharper voice. She felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. I don't need excuses, Amir said. I needed you to say that out loud, and you just did. Miss Langley's breath turned shallow. I'll see you when we land, he said simply. The line went dead. Miss Langley lowered the phone slowly, her fingers gripping it so tight that her knuckles turned white. Yeah, you're done. M. Langley didn't respond. Because she finally understood Camila's point of view. This wasn't just a meeting with the board, it was the end. Miss Langley stood in the galley, holding the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She knew she should put it down, but her fingers wouldn't move. Amir Rahim's words kept playing over and over in her mind, each syllable cutting through the wall of denial she had been trying to build. Don't regret what you did, regret that it was me. She had been so sure she could handle this. Miss Langley slowly put down the phone and said, Are you going to act like that conversation didn't happen, or are you finally going to admit it? Camila watched her from across the galley, with her arms folded. Are you going to act like that conversation didn't happen, or are you finally going to admit it? Miss Langley asked. Her voice was strained, like she didn't have the energy to keep up the act any longer. Camila raised an eyebrow. You knew exactly what you were doing. Miss Langley let out a sharp breath through her nose and said, I was just doing my job. Camila laughed quietly and shook her head. Right, and yet you only did your job differently when it came to one family. She tilted her head slightly, Funny how that works. Miss Langley felt heat rise up her neck and said, I don't need you to lecture me. You need a reality check. Camila shot back, and you're about to get one as soon as we land. Miss Langley turned away and reached for the nearest card, pretending to check. As her hands continued to shake, Camila would have let up. You're acting like this is unfair, like you're being targeted, but let's be real, you did this to yourself, she said. Miss Langley's patience broke, and she spun around with her eyes flashing. What about all the times I wasn't caught? What about all the times I made calls like this, and no one questioned it? Her voice was harsher now, with the bitterness of someone realizing too late that they were no longer untouchable. Camila's face didn't change, she just stared at her for a long time before speaking. That's the problem, isn't it? She asked quietly. You thought no one was questioning it. Miss Langley opened her mouth, but nothing came out because she knew Camila was right. Other passengers had looked at her with confusion when she double-checked their tickets, but not the men in suits sitting next to them. Other times, she had thought a woman in casual clothes had accidentally went into first class, but when she pulled out the white ticket, she was shown to be wrong. No one had ever called her out on it before, at least not in this way. But just because no one said anything didn't mean they hadn't seen it. Camila sighed and ran her hand over her face. You know, I always wondered when this would catch up with you. She looked at the clock on the galley wall. Looks like today's the day. Miss Langley swallowed the lump in her throat and turned away. She needed space to breathe. She pushed open the door. She regretfully stepped out into the cabin, but as soon as she did, every look felt like it was directed at her. The whispers, hushed conversations, and small changes in body language all felt magnified, as if the whole cabin had turned into a silent courtroom and she was on trial. A man in a navy suit was watching her over the edge of his glass, with eyes filled with quiet amusement. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman, quickly looked away when M. Langley's gaze flickered toward her. She tried to keep moving, but the pressure in her chest only got worse. When she got to the front of the cabin, near the exit row, she saw Amir Rahim sitting with the same quiet competence he had shown the whole flight. His elbow was resting on the armrest, and his fingers were lightly touching his chin. His eyes were focused on his phone, and he wasn't smirking or bragging, he was just existing in the space she had tried to make him feel unwelcome in, and that somehow. It got worse when she thought about walking past him like she had to do something important, but before she could, he looked up and met her eyes. She stopped moving. Amir didn't say anything because he didn't need to. His face was calm, but there was something else going on beneath the surface. Miss Langley felt her breath catch for the first time in her career. She realized she was being watched, not because of her title or authority, but because of the choices she was making. Twisting, she looked away, breaking the gaze. Without saying a word, she turned quickly and walked back toward the galley, her heart pounding against her ribs. She barely made it past the curtain before she felt like she couldn't breathe. She pressed her hand against the counter, her head spinning. This wasn't just about what had happened today. It was about the fact that she had never thought she would have to deal with the consequences of her actions. M. Langley gripped the counter, her breath short. The noise of the galley, the distant hum of conversation, and the occasional ding of the overhead announcement felt like static against her ears. She realized too quickly that her career wasn't just at risk, it was over. She had spent years walking these aisles with confidence, thinking she was untouchable. She had built her authority on instinct, based on what she thought was a first class passengers should look like, act like, and fit in, and now she was being judged on the silent stares, being accused without saying a word, and the worst part was that she deserved it. She closed her eyes for a moment to try to calm her breathing, but it didn't help. The intercom went off again. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright position. We'll be landing shortly. The words felt like a countdown. As M. Langley braced herself against the counter, every second brought her closer to whatever was waiting for her after touchdown. She thought about calling Nicholas Grant back to plead her case again, thinking that maybe if she explained herself clearly and said it was just a misunderstanding, they'd change their minds. But as the thought crossed her mind, she knew it wouldn't work because they already knew the truth. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a pattern, and she had been caught. Camilla walked into the galley when the curtain moved. She looked at Miss Langley's face and let out a slow breath. "You look like you're about to pass out," Miss Langley said, releasing her breath sharply and squeezing the counter even tighter. "Do you ever get tired of talking?" Miss Langley asked. "No, not really." Camilla smiled and leaned against it, tilting her head slightly. "You know, I've been thinking about something." Miss Langley sighed. Not in the mood for another one of her lectures. Another passenger, a guy flying with his family who wasn't rich or famous. Camilla didn't wait for an answer. She asked, "Would you have even apologized, or would you have brushed it off like you've done with dozens of other passengers before him?" Miss Langley froze. The truth was pressing down on her. She wouldn't have apologized. She wouldn't have been called to the cockpit. She wouldn't have had to face any consequences. The truth was. Her stomach turned at the thought of how she would have sacked Amir Rahi like she had other people before him. Camilla watched the change in her expression and slowly nodded. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Miss Langley looked away. She wanted to argue, she wanted to defend herself, but she couldn't find the words. Deep down, she knew she hadn't been unlucky or blindsided, she had been exposed, and now she was paying the price. Another ding went through the cabin. The plane was getting closer. Miss Langley let out a slow, shaky breath as she thought about what was waiting for her when the doors opened: security, executives, the formal hearing, and the shame. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't get away from it. Camilla looked at the curtain and said, "You should probably go back out there." Miss Langley snapped her gaze toward her, and Camilla gave her a small smirk. "Because it's the last time you'll ever walk through first class as a flight attendant," Camilla said. The words hit her harder than she thought they would. She swallowed hard and straightened her uniform one last time. She turned toward the curtain, let out a breath through her nose, and walked out into the cabin. As soon as she did, she felt it again. The shift passengers were quiet, their eyes flickering toward her as she moved down the aisle. Some whispered, others didn't bother hiding their faces. She walked past Amir Rahim's row, keeping her eyes straight ahead. She refused to look at him. She refused to acknowledge the weight of what she stiffened as she heard his voice say, "Good luck." He didn't say it maliciously or as a threat, he just said it, and that made it even worse because he already knew this wasn't just the end of a flight for her, it was the end of everything. Miss Langley kept walking, and with every step she took, she felt the life she had built falling apart behind her. The plane's wheels hit the ground with a soft thud, sending a shudder through the cabin. The usual routine played out, with people shifting in their seats. People in their seats stretched their legs and looked at their phones to see what time it was. The flight attendants made their final checks, walking down the aisles to make sure everything was in order. But for Miss Langley, none of it felt normal. She stood near the galley, her posture stiff, and her heart beating so fast that it was hard to breathe. In all her years of flying, she had never dreaded a landing like this. She always felt relieved when the plane touched down, knowing that the hardest part of the job was over and another flight was over. She gripped the counter tightly, her knuckles turning white as the seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Outside the window, the airport terminal grew closer, and she imagined what was waiting for her beyond that door: executives in stiff suits, security officers with expressions that couldn't be read, passengers still whispering about what had happened. She had seen passengers being escorted off flights before. It was always humiliating and always final. Now it was my turn. The intercom shook again, and the captain's voice was calm and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our goal. It's 3:45 p.m. where you are. Please stay seated until we get to the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today. There was a pause, and then the voice said, Miss Langley, please report to the jet bridge as soon as you land. Her stomach dropped, and the cabin fell into a creepy silence. People looked at each other, and some moved around in their seats. Even though she pretended not to be paying attention, everyone knew she was. She clenched her teeth and kept her face neutral, but her hands shook against the counter. Camilla took a slow breath next to her and said, well, there it is. Miss Langley didn't answer, because she already knew what was going to happen. As the plane slowed down as it approached the gate, the soft hum of the engine filled the air. Flight attendants moved through the cabin getting ready for disembarking, and the quiet murmur of. When the conversation started up again, Miss Langley stayed still, but she forced herself to move. She took slow, measured steps toward the front of the cabin, and every eye was on her. When she got to the first row, she saw him, a mirror where he was still sitting there, calm as ever. He hadn't rushed to get his things, and he was watching her not with anger or gloating satisfaction, but with something worse, expectation. She hesitated, but she forced herself to keep walking, because she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of recognizing him again. But then Noel Reggie spoke. I hope you remember this moment, Miss Langley, Miss Langley. Miss Langley's breath caught in her throat. She turned a little, but Noel wasn't looking at her with pity. She wasn't smiling. Her voice wasn't mean, it was just final. Elias sat next to his mother with his arms crossed, watching the scene with open curiosity. He didn't say anything this time, but his face said it all. Langley didn't respond. What could she say? She turned away and walked forward, but the words stuck in her throat. When the plane came to a complete stop, she was already at the front, standing stiffly near the door. Passengers stood stretching and retrieving their bags. She was supposed to be helping them say goodbye politely and thanking them for choosing their airline, but she wasn't doing that anymore. She was waiting for her own fate. The doors to the jet bridge opened, and a uniformed security officer stepped inside. Some passengers gasped softly, while others whispered in Miss Langley's throat. The officer looked around the cabin and immediately locked eyes on her. Miss Langley, he said, you'll need to come with us. The weight of the moment hit her like a tsunami. She couldn't breathe, but she nodded stiffly and forced her legs to move as she walked toward the exit. She could feel the shift, the judgment, and the quiet satisfaction of those who had been waiting for this moment. As she passed Amir Rahim's row one last time, she didn't look at him, because she couldn't. She stepped off. As she stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, her heart racing. With a thud, the doors shut behind her, and for the first time in years, she wasn't in charge. The airline that had once been her domain had just spit her out, taking away her job, her reputation, and the power she had so carelessly wielded. As soon as Miss Langley stepped off the plane, the cold air of the jet bridge hit her like a slap. It was a sharp contrast to the controlled, comfortable atmosphere of first class, where she had once held power, but that power was gone. Now she could feel it slipping through her fingers like sand, leaving nothing but a suffocating emptiness in its place. The security officer walked up to her, his face expressionless, but she could feel the weight of his presence. He wasn't rough or aggressive, but he also wasn't taking his eyes off of her either. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an escort. She had never been on the other side of an airline's disciplinary process before. She had been the one making decisions about who did and didn't follow the rules. Now she was being led away and dealt with. As she walked through the long jet bridge, her throat felt tight, and her shoes clicked against the hard floor. The farther she went, the more it felt like a walk of shame, a parade of silent punishment, before she even got to the real consequences. Then she saw them, two men in dark suits, standing at the end of the jet bridge. Their expressions were blank. They were airline executives. They were waiting for passengers or welcoming back crew members. They were here for her. She had seen this happen before and had whispered about it when other flight attendants were pulled aside after a flight when rumors spread about sudden firings and disciplinary hearings. But she never thought she would be one of them. The security officer stalked them just before they reached the two executives. One of the men, Daniel Pierce, a senior director in the airline's corporate division, and a tall man with neatly combed gray hair, stepped forward. Miss Langley had only met him once in passing years ago. Now that he had control over her future, he didn't waste time with small talk. Instead, he told Miss Langley in a harsh voice, "You are to follow us immediately to a private meeting room." Miss Langley's heart pounded against her ribs as she asked Pierce, "Am I being terminated?" Pierce's face was blank, and the word hearing sent a chill through her. This wasn't a casual chat, a private warning, or a quiet slap on the wrist. This was a formal proceeding. Pierce quickly turned around and started walking, expecting her to follow the second executive. A shorter but just as scary man walked up behind him, and the security officer stayed behind her, a silent presence that made it clear she had to do it. She did it, her legs stiff and her whole body numb. The hallway beyond the jet bridge was emptier than usual. Other crew members had already dispersed passengers, leaving only the sound of footsteps as they moved through the terminal. Miss Langley barely noticed where they were. Her mind was racing too fast as she tried to come up with any defense or excuse that might save her, but there was none. She couldn't take back what she had done. The image of Amir Rahim's calm, knowing gaze haunted her. He had handled the situation with such ease and control. He had never raised his voice or called for help. He had just let her fall apart. By mistake, she was now on the verge of her own destruction. A set of glass doors slid open as they reached a restricted area there. Pierce pointed to a small room at the end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar. Inside, Miss Langley hesitated for a second, but there was no escape. She stepped through the doorway into the simple, clinical room, which had a long conference table in the middle and a few chairs neatly arranged around it. A water bottle was placed in front of one chair, as if someone knew she would be here for a while. The walls were blank except for a company-branded screen mat. As Miss Langley moved toward the table, she saw something that made her stomach twist even more. A small laptop lay open on the table. The screen flickered, and within seconds, a video feed appeared, and there he was, Amir Rahim. Even through the screen, he controlled the room. His presence was just as strong as it had been on the plane. Miss Langley's fingers twitched against the chair Pierce, and the other executive sat down across from her. The security officer stayed at the door to make sure everyone was okay. Pierce put his hands together in front of him and said, "We are now beginning the formal hearing regarding the conduct of Senior Flight Attendant Evelyn Langley during Flight 726. She swallowed hard and clenched her hands together under the table to keep them from shaking. Amir's voice came through the speakers, steady and sharp. "Miss Langley, do you understand why we are here?" she asked. Her mouth felt dry, but she forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir, say it." Langley hesitated, and Pierce raised an eyebrow. Elias's earlier words, "Now you're asking," Noel's quiet but cutting remark, rang in her head. I hope you remember this moment, Miss Langley. She had spent most of the flight denying what was happening, telling herself it wasn't that bad and that she could fix it. But she couldn't. She had to face it. She cleared her throat and tried to keep her voice steady. I'm here, she said carefully. I failed to provide proper service to Mr. Rahim and his family. I made an unfair assumption. She didn't mean to, but she curled her fingers into a fist under the table. Amir didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, as if judging whether she really understood how important what she had said. Then he asked again, would you have treated my family the same if you had known who I was? Miss Langley flinched at the question again, her breath caught in her throat because there was no one watching or whispering to see her fall. It was just her and the truth, and this time she couldn't get away from it. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, and the word hung in the air, final and unavoidable. She had thought she was untouchable, but now she knew she wasn't. As the hearing went on, she finally realized this wasn't just the end of her job, it was the moment she lost everything. The silence in the room was crushing Miss Langley, and she could feel it wrapping around her chest. The weight of her own admission dropped like a vice around her throat, lowering her into the chair. She had said it, she had told the truth she had spent her whole career pretending didn't exist. She wouldn't have treated Amir Rahim's family the same if she had known who he was. The words echoed in her head, hitting the walls of the clean conference room like a death sentence on the screen. Amir Rahim's face didn't change, he stayed calm. It was hard to read, but there was something final in his eyes. The senior executive leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. Miss Langley, do you understand the gravity of your actions? He asked. Her throat was dry, but she nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. Do you understand that this is not just about one flight? She asked. Pierce looked at the other executive and then pressed a button on the laptop in front of him. The screen changed from Amir's face to something else. It was grainy, but clear enough, and the timestamp in the quarter showed that it had been recorded months ago. She saw a familiar version of herself walk through first class and stop at a row of seats where a black woman in a sleek business suit was sitting quietly with her boarding pass in hand and looking out the window. She didn't seem to be bothering anyone. Then, past Miss Langley's frozen horror, she saw herself lean down and say something to the woman. The woman's face lit up with confusion. Miss Langley could see her own lips moving, her posture stiffening, and the polite but firm tone of voice she had learned over the years. A moment later, another flight attendant, Camilla, walked in and ended the conversation. The woman stayed seated, but Miss Langley could see and feel it, the same pattern, the same assumption. The screen flickered again, showing a man in a casual blazer wearing headphones, looking through a menu. He was also interrupted by Miss Langley. She was polite and in control of the conversation, but her body language said it all. Miss Langley's body went cold. Pierce's voice pulled her back into the present. These are just 2 examples, he said smoothly. There are more. She couldn't breathe, her nails dug into her palms, her whole body stiff with shame. She knew these moments had happened, but she had never been faced with them. She had never been forced to watch herself to see how she looked when she made these snap judgments. Pierce kept talking in a calm but firm voice. We have received multiple reports over the years regarding your selective treatment of passengers. Until today there was never enough formal evidence to take action. He paused before adding that CHAT on this flight. Miss Langley clenched her jaw and kept her eyes fixed on the table. Amir's voice came through the speakers, sounding as calm as ever. Would you like to deny any of this, Miss Langley? She really wanted to, but she couldn't. The evidence was right in front of her, and she couldn't move her lips to say no, sir. There was another heavy silence in the room. Pierce took a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. Let's move on to the next step. Her breath hitched. Next step could only mean one thing: firing. She wasn't naive. She knew there was no way out of this. The evidence was too damning, and the airline wouldn't risk keeping someone like her on staff after Amir Rahim had been involved. Pierce adjusted his tie, saying, "Miss Langley, as of now. Right now, your job with this airline is being officially reviewed. A final decision will be made in the next 24 hours, but I can tell you right now," he looked into her eyes, "the chances of you keeping your job are very slim to none." Miss Langley felt like the walls were closing in on her. This was the moment when everything fell apart. She had spent years thinking she was untouchable, that as long as she was professional and followed the rules, no one could hurt her. She was wrong. Amir let out a breath through the speakers. "You may not have meant to be unfair to Miss Langley, but you were, and today you finally have to live with the consequences." The truth of what he said hit her harder than anything else, and it was the first time she had to face the consequences. Pierce tapped his fingers against the table and said, "Miss Langley, you will be escorted out of the terminal. Your employee badge has already been deactivated pending final review. You are not to return to any airline property." The finality of it all made her head spin. She had come to the meeting hoping to save her career, but now she was leaving with nothing. Amir said, "Good luck, Miss Langley." The laptop screen went dark. Pierce closed his folder and stood. The second executive followed him, and the security officer stepped forward to greet her. The meeting was over, and so was her career. Miss Langley didn't move at first. She just stared at the empty space where Amir's face had been. She finally got up, but her movements were stiff and robotic as she followed the security officer out of the room. As she walked through the quiet hallways of the terminal, passengers and flight crews went about their daily tasks as if nothing had happened. But for Ms. Langley, everything had changed. For years, she had made other people feel like they didn't belong, but now she was the one who didn't belong. As she walked through the last set of doors, she left behind the only job she had ever had. She realized she had never really been in charge. The airport terminal stretched out in front of Miss Langley like an endless hallway of glass and steel, but she wasn't walking through it as a flight attendant anymore. She was walking through it as an outsider, as an employee without a title, as a woman whose years of experience now meant nothing. A security officer walked a few steps behind her, silent but present. She wasn't handcuffed or being dragged out like a criminal, but it still felt like she was being sent away. Some people were rushing to get to their next flight, while others were just strolling along, unaware that the world was falling apart around them. People in clean uniforms and polished shoes clicked against the floor, passing her by. She had once been one of them, but now she was nobody. The automatic doors opened as she walked into the arrivals area, where the smell of coffee from the airport cafe mixed with the sound of rolling suitcases and muffled airport announcements. It was a place she had been 100 times before. But never like this. She wasn't going to work. She was leaving it behind for good. She tightened her grip on her purse strap as she forced herself to keep walking. She didn't know where she was going. Her car was parked in the employee lot, but she wasn't sure she could even get to it anymore, and her ID badge had been deactivated just hours before. She had used it to breeze through security checkpoints and competently enter restricted areas, but now it was just a useless piece of paper. She found a piece of plastic at the bottom of her bag and reached into her pocket to pull out her phone. She hesitated for a moment before unlocking the screen. Immediately, a flood of messages asked her, "Colleagues, what happened? Why are people saying you were pulled from the flight? Is it true you had a meeting with the executives? Tell me this is all a misunderstanding." She read each message, but didn't respond. What could she say that she had finally been called out for what she had been doing for years? She spent her whole career judging people quickly without thinking about the consequences. She had made the wrong assumption about the wrong passenger, and now she was paying the price. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't reply. Instead, her eyes fell on the one message that stood out from the rest. It wasn't from a coworker, it was from an unknown number. It was a single message that said, "I hope you take this as a lesson, Miss Langley, not just for today, but for the years before today." She stared at it for a long time, her breath short. He didn't need to send it. She had already lost her job, been humiliated, and been escorted out of the only place she had ever felt powerful. But this message felt like the final blow, because it showed that he saw right through her. He knew this wasn't just about one mistake, it was about all of them. For years, she had ignored a passenger and made assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. But it only took one wrong person one moment to bring it all to light. Suddenly, a voice said, "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you waiting for someone?" She turned around and saw that she was standing still near the exit, with her phone still in her hand. A security guard was watching her with interest, so she forced a tight smile. He nodded and walked away, but she knew what that look meant. She was just another person, no uniform, no status, no authority, just another woman standing at an airport exit with nowhere to go. She let out a sigh and finally put her phone away. As she walked into the unknown, the city greeted her with cold air and the dull roar of traffic. She didn't know what would happen next or who she was without her job, but as she did, the deep truth settled inside her. For years, she had made people feel like they didn't belong. Now, for the first time in her life, she knew what that felt like, and it was unbearable. That's the end of the story. What do you think about what happened? Let me know in the comments below if you liked this video. Subscribe, like, and share the video if you want to see more stories like this. See you next time.